The night air was thick with tension, the kind that settled deep in your bones. Michael stood at the edge of the rooftop, staring out at the city below, his hands shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. His breath came in shallow gasps as his mind raced, each thought a blur of confusion and dread. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had always kept his emotions in check, always been the rational one, but tonight, everything was unraveling. The secrets he had buried for years were clawing their way to the surface, and there was no escaping them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an urgent message flashing across the screen. The words were simple, but they were enough to send his heart into overdrive. "We need to talk. It's time." Time for what? What had he gotten himself into? His fingers trembled as he typed a quick response, but deep down, he knew it was too late. There was no turning back now. As the wind whipped around him, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his entire world was about to come crashing down. The stakes had never been higher, and the clock was ticking. He had no idea how much time he had left, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next would change everything. It wasn't always this way. Michael had once been a different man, a man full of dreams, ambitions, and hope. Back then, he had been surrounded by the people he loved, his younger sister, Lily, who was everything to him, and his best friend, Jake, who had always been by his side, no matter what. Together, they had dreamed of a future filled with possibilities, a future far away from the shadows that had always haunted their small town. But that was before the accident that had shattered everything. Michael had been there that night, but he couldn't remember what happened. At least not clearly. All he knew was that Lily was gone, and Jake was left in a coma, clinging to life in a hospital bed. The guilt ate at Michael every day, gnawing at his conscience because there was something he wasn't telling anyone, something that had been buried deep inside him. In the weeks that followed, Michael had tried to move on, but the pieces of his old life no longer fit. The town had grown colder, the people more distant, and the memories of that night lingered like a dark cloud over him. His once close relationship with Jake had been fractured beyond repair. Jake had woken up from the coma with no memory of the crash, but Michael could see the anger in his eyes, the distrust. Lily's absence had created a void that neither time nor words could fill. As Michael tried to rebuild his life, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone was watching him. He had always thought it was just his guilt creeping in, but there were moments when he felt like he was being followed, like someone knew his deepest secret. He'd shrugged it off, but deep down, he knew he couldn't escape what had happened. The past had a way of catching up with you when you least expected it. And now, it was catching up with him in a way he never could have imagined. The urgent message on his phone? It was a sign. The question wasn't what it meant, it was what he was willing to risk to face it, and if he could ever forgive himself for what he had done. The message on Michael's phone couldn't have come at a worse time. He had just finished a late meeting at the office, his mind exhausted from the grind of everyday life. It was just supposed to be a quiet night at home, but now that hope was dashed. The text came through as he sat on the edge of his bed staring at the untouched dinner he'd ordered hours ago. "We need to talk. It's time." Michael froze, his breath caught in his throat. The sender was unknown. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, the words lingering in his mind like a bad omen. He knew it wasn't just a random message. He had been waiting for something like this for years, and deep down, he had feared it. Without thinking, he hit the dial button. The phone rang 3 times before the voice on the other end spoke, low and strained. "Michael!" It was Jake. His voice cracked with emotion, but there was something else too. A hard edge, an urgency. "We need to meet. Now." The connection was brief, almost too brief, before Jake hung up. Michael stared at the phone in his hand, his heart racing. What was happening? Why now? His mind reeled, trying to piece together the significance. Jake hadn't been in contact with him for months, not since the fallout from the accident that had ruined everything, the one Michael could never forgive himself for, the one that left them both broken. But now Jake wanted to meet? Michael couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a reckoning. Standing in the middle of his apartment, Michael suddenly felt the weight of the past pressing down on him, suffocating him. The guilt, the anger, the fear, it all came flooding back in an instant. He had tried so hard to forget, to move forward, but now it seemed like the past was refusing to let him go. He grabbed his jacket and walked out the door, his mind spinning. What was Jake planning? And more importantly, what was he willing to do to confront what had happened? This was only the beginning. The first domino had fallen, and Michael knew the consequences would be far more than he could control. Michael arrived at the old diner on the outskirts of town just before midnight. It was quiet, the neon lights flickering, as if the place was barely holding on to the idea of being open. He spotted Jake in a corner booth, his face obscured by the dim lighting, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Michael took a deep breath before sliding into the seat opposite Jake, the silence hanging between them like an unspoken question. For a long moment, neither spoke. Jake's eyes, normally so full of life and energy, were now dull, haunted even. He looked different. His once carefree smile was gone, replaced by a hard mask of frustration. "You look like hell," Michael said, his voice steady but betraying the unease bubbling under the surface. Jake chuckled bitterly. "Yeah, I guess we both do." He paused, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "I don't know how to say this, but I think you need to know the truth. The whole truth. About that night." Michael's stomach dropped. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. His hands gripped the edge of the table, nails digging into the wood. "Jake," Michael began, his voice shaking slightly, "I don't need you to remind me of what happened. You think I don't live with that every day? You think I don't know the truth?" Jake leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "No, Michael, you don't. You think you do, but you don't. There's something you missed, something that no one told you." Michael's pulse quickened, the fear of the unknown creeping in. What could be worse than the guilt he already carried? What more could there be? "Tell me," Michael said, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. Jake took a deep breath. "The accident, it wasn't just an accident. Someone made sure it happened. And I think I know who." Michael's heart skipped a beat. His mind was already racing, trying to piece together the implications. Who could have orchestrated such a thing? Why? And most importantly, how was Jake involved in all of this? But Jake wasn't done. He looked down at the table, unable to meet Michael's eyes. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to drag you back into this mess, but it's bigger than we thought, and it's not over." Michael felt the walls around him closing in. What had started as a conversation was now a full-blown confession, a revelation that threatened to tear apart everything he had built since that night. The next few hours would be spent unraveling a tangled web of lies, deceit, and betrayal, each thread leading back to a person Michael never expected. Someone from his past. Someone he thought he had left behind forever. But the more he learned, the more he realized he wasn't just fighting the past, he was fighting for his future. And no matter how hard he tried to escape it, the darkness that had taken hold of his life was never truly gone. As the night wore on, Michael could feel the weight of the truth sinking in. The path forward wasn't going to be easy. It would require him to confront his past, to make impossible choices, and to trust a man who had betrayed him once before. But Jake wasn't the only one with secrets. Michael had his own to uncover. And in the end, those secrets might be the only thing standing between him and the life he desperately wanted to rebuild. Michael's world shifted on its axis when Jake revealed the truth that had been buried for so long. They sat in the quiet corner booth of the diner, the only sound between them the hum of the flickering neon sign outside. The weight of Jake's words hung heavy in the air, suffocating Michael. "The accident wasn't an accident, Michael," Jake repeated, his voice low but urgent. "And it wasn't just about you and me. There's someone else involved, someone we didn't see coming." Michael's heart pounded as his mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Who could have orchestrated something so devastating? Who could have twisted his life into this endless nightmare? "You're not making any sense, Jake. What do you mean? Someone else? Are you telling me that everything we thought we knew is a lie?" Michael's voice was a mixture of anger and disbelief. Jake nodded, his eyes filled with something that resembled guilt. I didn't want to tell you this, but it's the truth. It was your father. He was involved. Michael recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. His father. The man who had never once shown him affection. The one who had always been too distant, too wrapped up in his own world to ever truly care about him. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. No, Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. That's impossible. My father wouldn't. I know it's hard to believe, Jake interrupted. But I found the records, the phone calls, the meetings. He had been planning it for months, Michael. It was never an accident. Your father wanted you to crash, to fail. Michael's head swam, the room spinning as the realization slowly sank in. Everything he thought he knew about the accident, everything he had blamed himself for, was a lie. His father had been pulling the strings from the shadows, manipulating events in a way Michael couldn't even comprehend. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. And now, the truth was slowly coming to light. You're telling me my father? Michael trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. His father, the man he had always wanted approval from, had been the one to set everything in motion. The pain was unbearable, suffocating him. It felt as though the one person who should have loved him unconditionally had been the one to betray him the most. Michael's mind began to spiral. The years of trying to live up to expectations, the constant feeling of never being enough. It all made sense now. His father had been the architect of his misery. Jake's words broke through Michael's fog. You need to make a decision, Michael. This changes everything. You can't keep running from it. You need to confront your father. The tension in the air thickened. Michael's entire life had been a series of compromises, of fighting battles that weren't his. But now, this was his fight. And it was one he couldn't ignore any longer. The direction of his life, everything he had fought for, was now in his hands. The truth about his father hit Michael like a freight train, and in the days that followed, the emotional toll was unbearable. Every moment felt like an assault on his psyche, a constant barrage of questions and self-doubt that he couldn't escape. He spent hours pacing around his apartment, staring out the window, trying to come to terms with the revelation. The city lights outside blurred into a kaleidoscope of confusion, just like the mess inside his head. How could he have been so blind? How could he have spent years trying to earn his father's approval, only to discover that his father had been the one orchestrating his misery from the start? Michael's mind spiraled with anger and betrayal, the rage simmering beneath the surface. But underneath that, there was something deeper, something darker. Fear. Fear of confronting the man who had been the center of his life, even in his absence. Fear of the unknown and the consequences that would come with facing the truth. His phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his mother. Her voice was soft on the other end of the line, but Michael could hear the worry in her tone. Michael, what's going on? You've been so distant lately? Is everything okay? He squeezed his eyes shut, the familiar weight of her concern only adding to the pressure in his chest. He could hear the fear in her voice, the same fear that had haunted him for years. He had never been able to share his pain with her, not fully. He hadn't been able to tell her about the pressure he had felt growing up, the constant feeling of inadequacy. And now, he couldn't even tell her the truth about his father. I'm fine, Mom, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. I need some time to think. But that wasn't true. He didn't just need time to think. He needed answers. He needed to understand how deep the betrayal went. He needed to know why his father had done this to him, why he had never been enough, no matter what he did. Later that night, Michael sat alone in his apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He looked at the photos on the wall, snapshots of a life he had once believed was real. There, smiling beside his father, was the young version of himself, unaware of the truth lurking in the shadows. The guilt gnawed at him. Was it his fault? Had he been so desperate for approval that he had ignored the warning signs? Or was he simply a pawn in a game his father had set into motion long before he even understood the stakes? The question haunted him. But there was something else. The sense of powerlessness, the inability to do anything about it. The very idea of confronting his father filled him with dread. But avoiding it was no longer an option. What would it mean to face his father? To confront the man who had ruined his life? Would it bring the closure he so desperately needed, or would it break him completely? Tears welled up in Michael's eyes as he leaned against the table, the weight of the moment settling over him. The choices he made now, whether he faced the truth or ran from it, would define the rest of his life. There was no turning back now. He was at a crossroads, and the decision would determine his future. Michael had reached a breaking point. The truth about his father had shattered everything he thought he knew about his life, and the pressure was mounting. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending he was fine when every moment felt like he was drowning. That night, as he sat in his apartment, the weight of his father's betrayal pressing down on him, something shifted inside him. It wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It wasn't even about understanding why his father had done this to him. It was about reclaiming control over his life. For years, he had been a puppet in his father's game, manipulated, molded, and discarded. But not anymore. Without a clear plan, but with an overwhelming surge of determination, Michael made a choice. He would confront his father. No more waiting. No more second-guessing. He would go to his father's office the next morning and demand the truth. The decision felt like a weight being lifted off his shoulders, but it was also terrifying. Michael knew the stakes. The confrontation could break him. He might never be able to look at his father the same way again, but it was a risk he was willing to take. The following morning, he walked into his father's corporate headquarters with a mix of fear and defiance. The air was thick with the hum of business as usual, but inside Michael, everything was different. Every step felt heavy, every breath shallow, as he made his way toward the office door he had crossed 1,000 times before. When he entered, his father was sitting at his desk, as though nothing had changed. The man who had caused so much pain, who had shattered his world, looked up at him with the same distant, cold expression he had always worn. "You're here, Michael," his father said, his voice betraying no emotion. "What is it this time?" Michael stood tall, his heart racing. "I know everything," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You've been behind it all. You made sure I failed. You manipulated everything to keep me from succeeding." His father's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Michael pressed on. "Why? Why did you do this to me?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, his father stood, slowly walking around the desk, the coldness in his eyes now replaced by something darker, something that felt like a challenge. "You're naive, Michael." "You've always been naive," his father said, his voice sharp. "You think everything was about you. It was about power, about control. You were just a tool." Michael's blood ran cold. He had thought he was ready for this moment, but hearing the words spoken aloud made everything feel real, crushing his chest under the weight of betrayal. His father had never seen him as anything more than a pawn. The air between them crackled with tension, and Michael knew, deep down, that the conversation was far from over. The stakes were higher now. This confrontation had opened up a new world of pain, but it had also forced Michael to take control of his own narrative. It was a choice that would either lead him to freedom or doom him to a life of endless manipulation. The immediate aftermath of Michael's decision was nothing short of a whirlwind. He left his father's office feeling like he had just stepped out of a storm, his head spinning from the confrontation. But something inside him had shifted. He had stood up to the person who had controlled his life for so long, and now there was no turning back. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and tension. Michael's father didn't respond to his accusations directly, but his actions spoke louder than words. Within hours of the confrontation, Michael's life was thrown into chaos. His phone rang constantly, the calls mostly from people who were either too afraid to speak or too eager to exploit the situation. His father's empire had deep roots, and suddenly, Michael found himself in the eye of a storm he had never fully understood. Rumors began to spread. Some claimed Michael was lying, trying to destroy his father's legacy. Others whispered that Michael was simply a casualty of a bigger war, one that had been brewing for years. Whatever the story was, it didn't matter. The consequences were real. Michael was thrust into the spotlight under constant scrutiny. People from his past, both allies and enemies, started to resurface, their intentions unclear. He was no longer just a man dealing with his own issues. He was a pawn in a much larger game, one that had no clear rules. On a personal level, Michael's relationships began to fray. His mother, who had always been a source of comfort, became distant and guarded, unable to deal with the fallout from his father's actions. Friends he had once trusted began to pull away, unsure of which side to take. Even Jake, who had helped him uncover the truth, became more elusive, as if the weight of the situation was too much for him to handle. But it was the realization that his father was pulling strings behind the scenes that truly hit Michael hard. His father's influence reached farther than Michael could have ever imagined. The company was facing mounting pressure from within, and now Michael was being targeted, both personally and professionally. He found himself under investigation, his actions questioned at every turn. His name was being dragged through the mud, and his father, ever the master manipulator, was carefully distancing himself from the scandal, leaving Michael to take the fall. As the world around him shifted, Michael began to understand the full scope of his decision. The truth had come to light, but it had opened up a Pandora's box of consequences. He couldn't go back to the life he once knew. Every move he made seemed to lead to new challenges, new dangers, and deeper uncertainty. But despite everything, Michael couldn't help but feel a strange sense of resolve. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. He couldn't let his father win. He had to fight back no matter the cost. Michael's world had crumbled piece by piece. The whirlwind aftermath of his confrontation with his father was just the beginning. Now the pressure was unbearable. With each passing day, the betrayal felt heavier, the lies more suffocating. His father had turned the world against him, using his power and influence to paint Michael as the villain, the one trying to destroy everything he had built. The public was unforgiving, and Michael's reputation, already in tatters, continued to spiral. He was investigated by the authorities, his finances scrutinized, and even his closest allies began to doubt him. The company that had once been a part of his legacy was now in jeopardy, and his father's empire was closing in around him. But it wasn't just the public perception that weighed heavily on Michael. It was the crushing realization that no matter how much he fought, no matter how much he exposed the truth, his father still held all the cards. Then, the final blow came. Jake, the one person who had stood by him through it all, betrayed him. Michael had always trusted Jake implicitly, but now, standing in front of him, Jake's face was cold, devoid of the friendship they had once shared. He'd been working with Michael's father all along, a hidden pawn in his father's larger game. "I never wanted things to go this far," Jake said, his voice low. "But you forced my hand. You've made it impossible for any of us to stay out of this." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. The man he had confided in, the one who had helped him uncover the truth, was now the very person orchestrating his downfall. It felt like everything he had worked for, every step forward, had been for nothing. His trust had been misplaced. His closest friend had deceived him, and the truth was that he was alone. Tension peaked as Michael's resolve faltered. His life, his career, and his relationships were in ruins. The realization that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many truths he uncovered, his father had orchestrated it all and was still 2 steps ahead, crushed him. The stakes had never been higher, and Michael wasn't sure he could recover. Was this the end of the road for him? The audience was left in suspense, unsure if Michael could bounce back from the brink of total collapse. The darkest moment had passed. It took every ounce of Michael's willpower to pull himself back together. But after the betrayal, he knew he couldn't let this be the end of his story. Despite the emotional wreckage, the uncertainty gnawing at him, and the knowledge that his father's empire was still intact, Michael found a spark of determination. He began to reassess his situation, to see what he had left, and surprisingly, he found more than he expected. While everything had fallen apart, one thing hadn't: his mind. The investigative skills he had honed over the years were still sharp, and his ability to read situations and people hadn't disappeared. He wasn't going to let his father win. Michael began working in the shadows, gathering evidence and allies where he could. He reached out to old colleagues, former employees of his father's company who had seen the darker side of the business and were now looking for a way out. These were the people who, like Michael, had been silenced and suppressed, but they were ready to take action. Slowly but surely, he started to rebuild his network. He also took a hard look at the mistakes he had made along the way. His blind trust in people like Jake, his impulsive decisions, and his failure to anticipate his father's manipulative tactics had all contributed to his downfall. Now, Michael knew he couldn't afford to make those mistakes again. Every move had to be calculated, every decision thought through carefully. As he began to formulate his final plan, he started tying up loose ends. His relationships with secondary characters were strained, but Michael knew he had to repair them if he was going to move forward. His mother, though distant, was a key part of his final strategy. She had been just as hurt by his father's betrayal, and while she was still conflicted, Michael knew she could be a valuable ally. There was also the question of Jake. Michael's heart ached at the thought of their broken friendship, but he knew he had to confront Jake one last time. He needed closure. Needed to understand why Jake had done what he did. Could he trust him again? Or had the betrayal truly gone too deep to repair? With his plan taking shape, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The odds were still against him, and his father's power loomed large, but Michael had a clearer sense of purpose now. He wasn't just fighting to expose the truth anymore. He was fighting for his future, for his freedom, and for the life he had once hoped to build. As he prepared for the final confrontation, the stakes had never been higher. Michael had lost everything, but in a strange way that made him more dangerous. He had nothing left to lose. The final battle was approaching, and whether he won or lost, he was ready to face it head on. The final confrontation was set. Michael stood face to face with his father in the grand office that had once felt like home, now a cold, looming reminder of everything he'd lost. The room, with its towering windows overlooking the city, felt like a cage. His father sat behind his imposing desk, looking as composed as ever. But Michael could see the slight tension in his jaw. His father knew this battle wasn't over yet. Michael had everything prepared. Every bit of evidence, every ally, every piece of the puzzle he had painstakingly put together. It had taken weeks of meticulous work, but now it was time to expose the truth. The time for talk was over. Action was all that remained. "You really think you can bring me down, don't you?" His father's voice was laced with venom, but there was a flicker of something deeper: fear. Michael had him cornered. The empire that had taken decades to build, the empire that Michael's father had lorded over with an iron fist, was crumbling in front of him. Michael stood tall, despite the pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This wasn't about winning a legal battle or proving a point. This was about reclaiming his life, his future, and his dignity. The years of manipulation, the betrayal, the loss, it had all led to this. Everything you've built, everything you've done, it ends today, Michael said, his voice steady, unwavering. You will answer for what you've done to people, to me, and you will lose everything you've taken from me. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Michael's father didn't move, didn't flinch. For a moment, the silence seemed deafening. Then, with a smirk, his father stood up, moving toward a concealed drawer in his desk. "You think this is over? You think you can win against me?" He pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the desk, a mocking gesture. "This is just the beginning, Michael. You're too weak. You always have been." The folder contained a final blow, proof of Michael's supposed illegal dealings orchestrated by his father himself. It was a setup, a failsafe his father had designed in case things ever turned against him. Michael's heart skipped a beat. Was this the end? Would all his efforts, all his sacrifices, be in vain? But in that moment, something clicked. Michael had seen enough of his father's tactics to know this was just another lie. His mind raced, and he realized the flaw in the plan. The evidence was fabricated. He had already prepared for this. With a steady hand, Michael pulled out his own set of documents from the briefcase at his side, evidence of his father's manipulation, corruption, and criminal activity over the years. "No, Father," Michael said, his voice low and confident. "You're not going to win this time. The truth is coming out." What followed was a chaotic battle of wits and power as Michael outmaneuvered his father's final attempt to salvage his empire. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was personal. Michael's anger, hurt, and the weight of everything he had lost came pouring out as he finally stood victorious, watching as his father's empire crumbled. The emotional release was overwhelming. Michael had won, but it came at a cost. In the end, he stood tall, no longer a boy looking for approval, but a man who had fought for his future and emerged stronger. The audience was on edge, unsure if Michael would actually succeed, if his transformation would be enough to break the shackles of his past. But in this final moment, it was clear. Michael had found his true strength. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and unforgiving. The media coverage was relentless, and the world watched as Michael's father was exposed for his countless crimes. The empire that had once seemed impenetrable fell apart, piece by piece. Michael had emerged victorious, but the victory was bittersweet. His relationships with friends and allies had been tested to their limits, and while some remained loyal, others had faded into the background. Jake, who had betrayed him, was nowhere to be found. Michael's emotions were still raw, the scars of the betrayal not easily forgotten. Yet there was a strange sense of closure, of finality. The company, which had once been Michael's dream, was no longer the same. The future of the business was uncertain, but Michael had already decided that it was no longer his primary focus. The years of emotional turmoil had taught him what truly mattered: freedom, integrity, and a chance to rebuild something new. Michael's mother, though still distant, had reached out. The two of them began to repair their strained relationship. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For the first time in a long while, Michael didn't feel entirely alone. As he walked away from the remnants of his father's empire, Michael knew there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready. The path was no longer defined by his father's shadow. It was his to carve. The weight of the past still hung on him, but it no longer held him captive. With one last glance at the skyline, Michael stepped forward, a man reborn, his future no longer bound by the mistakes of his past, but shaped by the strength he had found within himself. The final resolution was not in the destruction of his father, but in Michael's own transformation, in his ability to rise above the darkness and create his own destiny. In the quiet moments after the storm had passed, Michael stood on the balcony of his new apartment, staring out over the city. The skyline, once a symbol of everything he had been forced to fight against, now seemed different. It was a place he could rebuild his life, not under the shadow of his father's empire, but as his own person. The weight of the past no longer pressed down on his chest. He had confronted his demons, faced his deepest fears, and emerged stronger than he ever thought possible. The man who had entered this battle was lost and broken, but the man who had survived it was resolute, determined, and finally at peace with himself. He had made the choice to let go of the bitterness, to forgive himself for the mistakes that had been made, and to move forward with hope. His mother had called him just that morning. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic apology, but their conversation had been simple, sincere. There was room now for healing, slow but steady. Michael had no illusions about their relationship, but for the first time, he felt the possibility of something more than just the silence they'd endured for so long. That, in itself, was progress. The business he had once inherited from his father no longer held the same appeal. Instead, Michael had begun exploring new opportunities, ones that would reflect his values, not the ones thrust upon him by a legacy of manipulation and control. He was starting fresh, with a clean slate, a chance to build something meaningful on his own terms. There would be challenges ahead. Michael knew that. Life was never going to be simple or easy, but for the first time, he felt equipped to face whatever came his way. The scars of his past remained, but they were no longer chains. They were symbols of his growth. his resilience. As the sun set behind the city, Michael finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because he knew the journey was only just beginning. The future was his to shape. And with that, the story closed. A new chapter for Michael, full of possibilities. The final moment a reflection of the transformation that had led him here, ready to face whatever lay ahead with strength and purpose.